I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 4th of October 2020. I'm sure you all are a bit concerned, if you, I suppose concerned is a rather weak word for all, isn't it? But I suppose everyone's getting the feeling of something again coming, something wicked and all that coming our way, because we're managed so well, aren't we? We're managed like children. And for me, it's just repetition, in a sense, because I gave talks many, many years ago about how we're living through scripts, basically, and how we're managed through the scripts without even being aware there are scripts, or how we're coming into new ways of doing things or accepting things socially, legally, in a whole bunch of different ways, in fact. And we're guided to having conclusions that are already preordained, basically, by those who rule us. And we are ruled. Bernays talked about it long before Bernays too. You had Benjamin Disraeli in Britain, who was a bit more open in his lucid moments, or sober moments maybe, about the way things really ran. And we are managed very, very carefully. But overwhelmingly now, with mass media techniques and television and entertainment all combined, working together. At the EU meeting they had, and I've put up the links before, that were all for vaccination, you know. It's about vaccination, and they had the big players in it as well. They said that they'd put a lot of money into entertainment to embed the suggestions, as I like to say it, about the coming vaccinations, etc., and how they would prepare people's minds in such a way that they don't even know what's happening to them. They really do believe they're coming to their own conclusions, bits and bytes of information repeated for ages until it becomes their thoughts, you see. And that's how you perceive it. Oh, it's my thought, so I came to that conclusion myself. I used to talk about the politicians and how I never listened much to politicians, because they go by rote when election time is just a sequence of topics which all parties will go through the same topics and promise it to the peasants, you see. The cattle, as they call them, all kinds of nasty ways of talking about the people. But it is the way it is. They talk about, education, employment, and so on, and unemployment as well, unemployment money and benefits, etc., etc., childcare, all these kind of things, all the socialistic programs that were introduced into a form of socialism, which have then trained the public. This is quite normal, as they make you utterly dependent on government. And government, remember, is your biggest problem, because the reason you are so poor is because they tax you into the ground to pay for the programs, but also to fill their own personal buckets, their take-home buckets, using your cash, because those who serve the big system live much, much better than the general population that pays all. But that's how it really is. We're managed by tyrants. Of course there's tyrants, and they're benevolent tyrants. They always smile at you. Most old tyrants used to just show their teeth on a nasty grimace. But our ones, they smile at you because they're good psychopaths, you see. Not very bright, some of them, but they're all on board together, and they're very resolute. I mentioned this word in a talk with Neil Foster, how the army has it, if you ever, soldiers will know this, we're going into battle, there's a stage you get to where you're resolute. And for first-timers, and it doesn't matter how many times they've been in battle before, it's all or nothing, and they all know it. Suddenly it really strikes home to them. This is real, It isn't little boys playing in the woods with toy guns. It's all real now. And some of them won't come out of this alive. Others ones will be made. So they're resolute, though, in their obedience, because you're trained to obey orders, and that's what they do. And if there's a weak link in the chain, then if you let go down, basically, or just freeze, someone else might suffer next to you. And, so everyone's resolute and doing what they're supposed to do. And those who use the police forces all the politicians behind the police forces are all in cahoots together, as you know. Why bother having so many politicians when they all repeat the same phrases, you know? The coming of lockdowns is necessary and vaccinations necessary, etc., etc. And they just parrot. Why not have one person parroting it? Then you know this point, there's a tyrant, you see. But they give you this appearance of having choices, and different voices saying the same thing. Well, maybe they're a bit different. They're not quite the same as that one over there. But they are, in reality. They're bought and paid for. They all belong to the same clubs. We can say clubs or lodges. It doesn't make any difference, really, does it? Because they're sworn to organisations which selected them before the public select them, or think that they select them. And I used to say years ago, the only way to stop it all, at least that part of it, would be to at least demand and have, and everything's so corrupt I don't think you could even do it, but you would need independent groups that were really honest, which would be impossible in this day and age, I think, to check on those running for politics, and to find out who they've given allegiance to already. What organisations like the CFR, for instance, or the Trilateral Commission, and because they actually put their own members into politics occasionally too, CFR more so. And even if they're not elected, you'll find a big chunk of your civil service, the higher members of them in different departments, they're members of the CFR as well, strategically placed. And that's a lot of people, especially when you take what used to be a British Empire system, or to Australia and New Zealand, any country that still has a Solicitor General assigned by the Crown, and Canada's still got one yet, and so does the rest of them, then you're really under the same system, this strange democracy, but at the very top you've got a monarchy, you see, who has to okay everything and introduce a lot of things themselves at the top, and deny a lot of things that come from those that you think are elected. So you're living in a fantasy, really. And what you've got too is what you think is a stable society, semi-stable societies at times, which again is a very thin veneer, because really society is very turbulent. And if you could see the turbulence, if you just got back from a nice sunny day and all that, and the smelling folk eating ice cream in the old days, you know, before you had the open tyranny. But underneath it all, it wouldn't take much to spark off trouble between different peoples, religions, ethnic groups, political groups, ideological groups, you know, from communism, Marxism, socialism, all the brands are the same thing, really, you know. It's like cigarettes that are tipped and unfiltered and plain, all versus each other. So it doesn't take much to really spark it off. And I've always said this, everything will work even in a massive open society. You know, you've heard the term so many times. The trilaterals use it all the time, because their job is to bring in a borderless world eventually, but dominate it. Their own members would dominate it more openly. Trilaterals themselves are real technocrats. They're part of the big technocracy, where they would get things done without being elected, you see. And they all came out in force with Jimmy Carter many years ago. He had more trilaterals than ever. That's really when they came out. And they're really associated. They've all been members of the CFR, and then they're selected for their higher purposes. Because you don't think you're run by your governments. I really don't think that at all. Even before World War II, they had these organisations, different names for them all, running the system, even though British Empire. And because they didn't trust politics or politicians, you know, or the people for that matter. And so they make sure there's always a deep state there, of course there is. And the problem in the US is they're completely overtaken by what used to be the radical revolutionary groups. And some of them are foreign in a sense, you know, that really run everything and turn everything upside down. So your official organizations in the state, even the FBI, is beyond compromised by the very people that the FBI was there to investigate. Run by them now. It's quite interesting to see who advises the FBI. It truly is in this day and age. So I won't go into it in too much detail because it's boring, really. But things are rather out in the open today as to who even Antifa is, and even their own parent organisations are out boasting about it, of who started it up and who still runs it today. But yeah, you're living in a make-believe system where you think that your country is still a John Wayne type system. You know? Again, Hollywood gave you, in America and the world, the Western world to an extent during the Cold War, but they gave you sometimes, not all the time, they gave you both sides of it. Before World War II and during World War II, Hollywood was churning out communist movies, for those who didn't know, because suddenly you were supposed to be pally with Uncle Joe, Stalin. And the big bad bear was a happy guy now. It was a jolly bear, you know. And eventually they turned it back again. But during the war years, they had the propaganda movies out there with the tractors, the usual stuff, you know, the con game of people, you know, working happily on the farms for the good of all, etc. You know. Well, I won't go too far into it because it wasn't all in the Soviet Union. But anyway, they churned these things out and got away with it, and they could get away with all the bad capitalists and so on. It's so comical, really, because it's a joke, because the top capitalists were the ones who fund the communism, still are, fund the communism. Because communism is a front for a domination of the planet by another group, you see. That's, of course it is. Of course it is. There's never been a time where people have brought in a system, financed it all, planned it all, like revolution, and then given it to you, and then walked away and left it to you to manage. It's never happened. It's a joke. It's never happened. It never will happen. Those who finance it have always had the idea of dominating the planet themselves, and it's much, much deeper than that too. You know, some claim it's religious to an extent, without you, a bit different from the religions that you think of. Remember, religions can also simply mean belief systems. Some people, Marxism is a religion. You need a lot of faith to believe in it, that it would work. And communism too, because it's always making promises to make the human condition itself content, which cannot happen in society, in the human being, and everybody. For those who can remember, even those who are going through it right now too, when you're teenagers and then into your 20s, maybe even into your 30s, you definitely are going through ups and downs like crazy through life. Most people are not completely stable in that respect, because you're experiencing lots of different, they call it the milestones and psychodynamics that you'll go through, which is simple observation by behaviours, and it's very true what they tell you about different ages and different things that you'll do, what you'll think, the drives will kick in, even hormonal drives and so on, and what that does to you and what it'll do. But the thing is, you had experts way above that can manage it all, you see, for their own benefits, and that's why they always pick the young for rebelling. And don't think, when you look at the ones who are rebelling today, it's just spontaneous. They're getting pumped up to do it by social media, where the leaders, of course, of all, are trained. They're actually trained revolutionaries and financed, very well financed and well paid. They retire with pensions too. So you're living in a kind of make-believe world all the time, much like getting back to World War II and after World War II, when they were churning out propaganda movies. They gave you an idea of a wonderful, clean society, very clean, you know. And of course, that's what really got people in Europe and across the world looking at the movies. They said, goodness sakes, the people in America have big cars. Most folk in Britain didn't have cars, you see. It was even astonishing to see them all have, in the movies, it didn't matter who they were, having phones. This is the impression they gave you. And, they've all got phones. It's so expensive in Britain to have a phone, you know, a personal phone. Doctors would have phones. People were important, you see, in society, in the community, but most folk didn't have the phones. because they were expensive, and just making local calls was expensive, never mind long distance calls. So they didn't so much have cars, and they didn't have phones, most folk. That's why you see these British phone boxes all over the place in the movies. They existed right up into the 1970s, 80s. They started dwindling with the cell phones in the 90s. But they were all over the place, in Britain and in Europe too. But people would see these movies from Hollywood and think, my goodness, these people are so rich. Even the working class is rich. Look, that's how it seemed to be, you see. But it was all make-believe, and it was propaganda. And it was put out not just for people abroad, but also people in America too, to give them the impression that even if they're in the bottom rungs of society financially, they were part of something bigger and better and clean and decent. It kind of gave that optimistic feeling. And at that time too, there was more optimism because there was a lot of work. The war brought in a lot of industry, an awful lot of industry, mainly for the war effort, you see. Unlimited financing. That's why the elite love crisis, you see, whether it's pandemics or wars of other kinds, when there's just billions of tax money getting tossed all over the place into pockets, then they can also use some of it, you know, even though it's supposed to all go towards making factories or whatever happens, or vaccines, makes all the same kind of stuff. It's very Orwellian, you know. How many tanks have we churned out today? We've got 2,000 more tanks than we thought we'd get this week, and we've broken our quota, and they'd all do a big hooray, etc. And now it's going to be how many vaccinations you can give out, how many tests you can do for COVID. Same techniques being used. But again, in America, that was the impression that they gave generations. And there were people whose mums, they thought it was, especially women, they thought it was all real. They'd come home and they'd look at their husbands, and husbands often had, you know, they were miners, for instance, or they worked in factories and things like that when there was factories to work in. But none of them were dressed in the suits and tie in the working class, you see. And they didn't have cars. They didn't take their wives out to ballroom dancing like Fred Astaire would do. And so the women were bored stiff, and all thought they should have that kind of life, like flappers in a sense, and have a great time with these very wealthy people. They were all on celluloid. It was all movies. It was all fiction. But it helped disrupt society to an extent, because people who are not happy with reality will try and act it out in other ways. A lot of them did, and of course marriages started to break up in probably in the 60s and definitely in the 70s. It was pretty getting more common, especially with the younger people. So folk have no idea that you're living through fiction most of the time. And you follow the fiction, including the reactions to what you're supposed to do as they're destroying society and destroying marriage. You actually, we just got divorced and you can't work through this. And of course you had massive promiscuity with the pills of say throughout Europe and so on. And even then, you had a lot of fallout from unwanted pregnancies, as I like to call it now. But the state stepped in immediately in this socialist system and took care of that, of course. Until we're at the mercy of the state in so many ways, right down to, should we, just like, you know, you find that some of the founders of the Fabian Society, you know, for world socialism, some of the founders like George Bernard Shaw saying that you'll come to us. He says, you think we're going to give the working man a good life, and no, he says, you're not going to have a wife to come home. We want her out there working as well. And so this is what they're telling you, what socialism really means. It's not, most people, they get people to rile up and follow them initially just for having a decent working wage and more guarantee of having the work as opposed to being laid off every other week sort of thing, or a month. But no, they have other ideas what it's all about. They want to double the tax base, destroy marriage altogether, and then rule over you. And here we are today. And he said that you'll come to us and we'll decide what you have to tell us why we should keep you alive, you know. It was really quite fascinating. In the 80s and the 90s up to the present, the same technique was used when they brought out, oh my goodness, people are going to get laid off before they're 40 now, and they were talking about in CEO jobs, or upper management jobs, and you'll never have a lifelong job for the rest of your life ever again. So that's a thing of the past and so on. But they'd actually put forms out. That was all borrowed from socialism. Because they understand, those who own the big businesses, their bosses at the very, very top, not the top dominant shareholders, are the same characters that give you communism. So they would hand out to their employees, when they're downsizing, forms or questionnaires. Well, why should we keep you here? What is your contribution to the fact? And you decide to fill it in yourself, you see, and put yourself out of work. Same thing. You have to start seeing how things are connected in life before you'll ever really figure things out in any other way, personally, for your own benefit and what's happening to you. And when you're having your little rebellions in adolescence, and you won't know what you're rebelling about really half the time, you're just uncomfortable with everything, and things aren't the way it should be, in your own personal lives, and some folk will blame the whole of society for it, you see. So you're easy to get picked up, and you're meat really to be used by those who want to use you for other purposes. So yeah, you're not completely stable all through your life, even with your own relationships at times as well. Because you're fighting different instincts, and the instincts are to bond, whether you like it or not, with sexual mates. And where the whole agenda has been for an awful long time is to separate the bonding process and intimacy from the sexual act. That was Frankfurt School spelled out quite literally like that, and other groups too. So you're left with a big kind of chasm in your life at times as well, when you want something that's just not going to be, be there. Remember too, Brave New Worlds, and they had this again, that was showing utopias. So it was a scientific utopia for Brave New World, where the scientific groups would run your lives, and they'd actually breed you for tasks, and even keeping the city going. And those instincts that were still human were catered to as well. But you had to have sex all the time, but never with the same partner, I think twice in a week. You'd be watch for that, to make sure you didn't bond. And you would get someone that would interfere and warn you if they notice you starting to get, seeing the same person more often and starting to bond. It was a taboo. These stories weren't written just for the fun of it. They were written by people who were in the deep state of the era, in the scientific groups. And scientific groups weren't just a hodgepodge of independent scientists looking for work at times and scraping for work. They were the top managers. The governments had always, especially in Britain, they really had developed a system of behaviorists and psychologists, even before the psychologists got their real time as professionals, because Britain at one time ruled a good part of the world. I hate calling it Britain. I mean, it was London that owned it all, and folk who lived in the city of London owned it all, and they owned the resources. That's what they were after. There was only a few thousand families really ran and really owned the whole empire. But they had to keep a form, a semblance of order over the people. It's far better having them comply by altering and changing and even giving them a new culture, which they'll still think is their own. You see, when they see officials dressed in the same national garbs as themselves at the top and things like that, they don't realize, no, you're bringing a new system regardless of the flags. I've mentioned this so many times, and your national anthems and things. That's how even in the States, they don't even know. When they see the same formats every few years of presidents getting sworn in and top people getting sworn in, and people draping the flag around them, and sing the same old things, and the national anthems and brass bands and that, they don't realize they're 180 degrees of where they used to be facing. They don't know. And it's the same with the old British Empire. different parts of India. There were so many different nationalities ethnic nationalities within India, and hundreds of languages. That Britain tried to make it more uniform, and they put these satrapies all over the place and people in charge of them. But it wasn't just a commissar and so on. They'd have whole big staffs of people who worked and lived amongst the people, as the people, and kept tabs on everything. A spy mechanism, but massive. And that's how you kept tabs on things. And you can, anybody who was a bit brighter than the rest maybe, and could communicate better, and who knew what was happening, and could really pass on what he understood and communicate. He could communicate to others. He could be a future risk down there because of his abilities. And so they'd either try and recruit him, buy him over, which was often generally successful, or else they'd have to liquidate him. Exactly what Bertrand Russell said in his own books on it. The elite have always used this technique. He's talking about Britain as well. They could have scholarships out there for the brighter ones, and bring them into the hallowed halls of basically the granite buildings, the old buildings. And they'd be overwhelmed at the honour of getting into these places where every famous person in the British history had gone before them. And then they'd bring them into little societies, little clubs, and before you know it, you win them over. But he said they'd have to, such people from the working classes or the lower classes would have to give up their affiliations, their own family background, and their people, and their area, working class area. But he says if we can't bring them over to us and buy them off, basically, he said we'd have to annihilate them, eliminate them physically. And that's how things really are. That's how it's always been. And Britain had been using it across the world for years, that technique, you see. And I'm sure other nations before that had empires did the same kind of thing. Knowledge is generally very old, and why relearn it? It's like reinventing the wheel. They keep incredible archives of how to do these things down through time. And for the elite too, there's an elite money class too, going way back thousands of years, that always moved out of nations when the trouble was, when the barbarians were moving in, put it that way. And when everything was so debauched and cities were collapsing, like Rome, the Roman Empire, they move out with their money and they see it all coming, the brighter ones, and that they have their own communication ability through the old caravan trails and commerce and sea. And they prepare for it and move out and take the money with them. And when they did that, that's why you see suddenly an empire would start off in another country, because people had moved in with money. That happened in Holland, as an example. And so there are different factions of societies all involved in this big thing we called humanity and the human species. But today, for world domination, which again the trilaterals, remember, are part of, they were set up to bring in world domination, a specialized branch, really, of the higher CFR, or what was the Lord Alfred Milner group, that again was for world domination. And you can tie them in with the Rockefellers, who was a part of the groups as well, you see, because Rockefeller was open about it too. He says competition is a sin. Odd thing coming from a top capitalist, or is it? You got to get out of your head what you think these folk are. And don't get confused by their words and so on. They want order in society. Competition's a sin. The Alfred Milner group not only used the British Army to take over and police these nations on behalf of their group, their clique, basically, but they also had to manage the minds of all the different peoples and different cultures and so on. But they wanted a society where everything was ordered, and the right people should look after resources, which was themselves, you see, the people who ruled the Milner group, they had the right to take over. That's what Rockefeller's talking. He belonged to the same organizations, you see, world domination. Different names, they would morph their names across the world at times, so folk couldn't really figure out it was the same group. And nothing's changed. Now remember, folks, you can help me out too by buying a book or discs at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, or donating to me. Straight donations are really, really welcome. And you can send cash, you can send a check, you can use PayPal, MoneyGram, and there's other methods too, to get the cash to me, because it's important that I just come through all this and talk to people on the way, because we need each other. And we've got to have, I've got no axe to grind. I've got no backing from any political party. I don't bother with politics. And all the world's a stage, as I say, to an extent. Or as I say, all the world's a tax base and we are the payers. You can help me take along by, again, sending some cash my way, cuttingthroughthematrix.com. And you'll see how to do it. There's something that was put out not long ago by the Trilaterals again, and don't forget Kissinger and his characters are all part of the Trilateral organization that set themselves up ruling over 3 parts of the world, you see, Trilateral. And they brought in, again, with the CFR group, that they're really a bigger brand, higher branch of, or a specialized department of, really. How they would divvy up the world and look after its resources, and they gave you the European Union, they gave you what was to be the North American Union, NAFTA. And then they changed the name of it to make you think that Trump cancelled it. No, he didn't cancel it. They just literally changed the name of it. It's the same organization. NAFTA morphed into the USMCA. Same organization. Nothing really got changed except the name. Same with the Trans-Pacific Relationship Pact, etc. It's the same one that Obama was started under Obama, that continued through Trump's reign as well. So we're still being conned all the time, and it doesn't bother me, because I didn't expect it to be any different ever, because we're always conned. I think every generation is conned and managed, again, under this massive world system of dominance by those who know. But yeah, Britain eventually handed the baton over to the US at the end of World War II. Some say World War I, Rudyard Kipling, in fact, attended the US and gave a talk. One of the few people to give a talk to the Senate, on the Senate floor, about handing the torch over to you. And when he found out that Britain was going to get scratched pretty well out of it, Kipling really lost it to an extent. He still thought they'd be shared partners, and Britain would still have a role to play as a dominant partner as well, but no, it was the other way around. They didn't know that. Although Britain, London, the names are awful, aren't they? You always say the British folk. No, it's not the British people do anything. This little place, it's called the City of London, decides the fates of the whole of the UK pretty well. And also the fates of a good part of the world, financially, still, to this day. But the techniques aren't tossed out. As I say, they're kept in archives, special archives, and how to rule. And those who move from place to place, as empires rise and fall, take the knowledge with them. Why, as I say, why keep reinventing the wheel? They don't do that. And we find the same kind of things going on with Machiavelli. He was pretty good at telling us how to do and manage the system, and how to manage the people. That's what it's all about, managing the people and keeping them. You try and give the people of all cultures basic stabilities and basic work. If you interfere too much in the work, it'll fall apart. They'll turn on you see. And so you want to keep them working, and make them mainly think that they were still working for themselves, even the small tradesmen and so on. As a good ploy, that is, make them think they're still working for themselves as you gradually increase the taxes. Today, we're going through amazing times, because they published everything they wanted to do years and years ago, using different crises, from Cold War. It was one of them. Then you had the 2008 crash, 7 and 8 crash. And before that, you had 9/11 again. You lost all your privacy. You gave it up for the common good. Oh, well, we're all under threat, so we better give it up for the common good. And that's how things are really run, once it starts, you never get away from it. And so everybody quite happily holds their pants up in the airports, etc., with their shoes off, looking like a real fool. Now I guess you've got a mask on to prove that you really are a fool. But, this is how it's done, You change society by changing the visual aspect of so much of it. It's interesting. Very interesting if you get into the minds and the communication systems of people who are blind. Because they're not so trapped by the visual aspects, which really affects the way that you perceive things. And they'll ask me more questions. Why do you have to do that? Why do you have to do this? What does it look like when you're, to you as a person who's sighted, when you see these folk holding up their pants and they got their shoes off and they're getting x-rayed at the airports but now they've got masks on and things like that, It's quite comical to realize they're asking the questions that everybody else should be asking, but it doesn't take you long if you've got the visual abilities to adapt into the system and think it's all quite normal. Really, yeah? It really is amazing what we live through, isn't it? And how you constantly adapt into utter ridiculous scenarios. Honestly, if I had the money to do a comedy show, I'd be doing it right now. The skits are endless comedies. You could dream up about 25 skits a day quite easily. And it's the best way, really, just to show people how silly they are, make them laugh at themselves. And the system they're in, which they've adapted into, is through comedy and satire. And they're not finished yet. With as I've said before, I used to kind of look at Britain. It's a strange way of looking at it, because they would churn out Fahrenheit 451, the movie, Even when I was a child and I saw it, I thought this is it looks antiquated. You know why it was? I guess it was the setting, the way that things in Britain seemed to be done on a small scale. The cars were generally smaller, for eventually folk could buy used cars. Seldom you see a new one anywhere. I often wondered if they ever had new cars in Britain at one point, one small phase, Because most of them really, if they ever collided with anything, would just go into a puffball of brown rust. Boof. That's what I always saw in Britain for cars, second-hand ones. But once they gave them credit cards in the 80s and the 90s, they get good debt, you see, and buy new ones and pay them off. But Britain, that Fahrenheit 451, it gave you the impression of kind of almost a nostalgia built into the sci-fi, of people being cozy, a kind of cozy community type. That's the idea, cozy community kind of thing. So you'd see a small town, and you see the fire trucks going through it with the big tannoys shouting it for everybody to come out into the gardens, men, women, and children, which they had to do by law, you see, because it was a socialistic type system. Now, you can call it fascistic, socialist, it's all the same thing. Exactly the same thing as far as I'm concerned. Same techniques are used for everything, and paperwork for everything too, and permits and yada yada. So they see the families going into the gardens there, as these things go past them to check them on, so looking for a fugitive. And it just seems so silly, small townish. And the fact too that they didn't have the money in Britain to churn out a lot of special effects in those days, They were always broke after, I guess, World War II, and it never recovered from World War I, really. But then when you found out, when you look at even the old Doctor Who scenarios, and it was World Health Organization, I suppose, but Doctor Who and his the time machine, Time Lord, of course. A different story behind it, what Time Lords are, actually. But they showed you, again, the small town scenarios, the settings here and there in villages and towns, a little bit of special effects and so on, but it still seemed that kind of quaintness that always seemed to put into their productions, the quaintness. And I thought, really, it's a great way to introduce that which is new, isn't it? Under the guise of we're still quaint, we're still small, even though you're not, the impression that you're still small towns, small villages, small communities, this idea of what it used to be, and bring in the new totalitarian regimes gradually until it is the normal. You're in the sci-fi movie, the things that you used to say that could never happen, you know. You're actually in it. You're hearing the same phrases as they introduce different parts of the silly agenda being used for the public. Again, never mind the slogans, they were all in it together and so on. And then you realise that things that you used to laugh at, when these old things in Britain, they're actually here. I think you could probably do it faster in Britain than any other country, really, bring in these techniques. When you see the things that they're forcing them to do, the total, never mind the fact they've finished what Britain used to be completely. It was all deliberate. It's not happenstance. It wasn't just being nice to massive migration. It's been planned this way for years. And then mass unemployment. I don't care about statistics. It's all nonsense about job statistics. It's absolute rubbish in every country. And right down to folk getting a universal basic income to stay at home, just like they do in the States and other countries too, and Canada. I think some business in Canada can claim it as well. So the employees get locked down and they get paid by the state, right out of Bertrand Russell, for goodness sake. And the state has your social credit system. The same as China. China was always the test base for all. And the companies that are doing it here all worked with them in China to make it all work, to see how it would happen. I remember Yahoo was in there big time doing programs like this. And then Google, of course, too. And then they give it to you see. And call it something else for a different reason, but it's the same thing. And Bertrand Russell said the state will give you credits into your bank account. In the 1940s he said this. Not because he had a crystal ball. It's because he sat with the big think tanks. He sat with the groups that also knew the Huxleys and worked with them, the scientific type groups that also had lots of people in sociology and psychology and anthropology involved in them too, and the behaviourists. He said, the state will dish out you so many credits every month or week or whatever, and he said that if you became labelled as antisocial, I mean you disobeyed a group concept put out for you. You all had to obey the same. You'd be antisocial and you get punished by withdrawing the credits or withholding them. And you couldn't use these credits. You couldn't save them up like a normal money thing would do if you didn't use them. It would start off at the same amount in that bank account every week. You see? And it gave the impression it would be kind of electronic. And here you're seeing it done. There's articles now in Britain. I noticed there where there's a woman, a young woman, and a guy who they knew each other through an organisation. Again, a political organisation. I'm not sure what it was, but she just had her bank account closed by the people who owned the banks. No excuse given. I couldn't get any excuse, but she eventually works. It's because of maybe her political affiliations or her points of view. Bang, that's it. So they're doing it all. All the stuff they talked about in the groups that Bertrand Russell belonged to back then. And they were given authority. Truman given authority, President Truman, and others as well, to create a post-World War II culture for the West. Not a static culture, but step by step, alterations of culture right to where we are today. Quite fascinating. With a massive bureaucracy, like a huge think tank, working out all the details and how to implement it. It would be a Fabian type thing where it would take years to implement, maybe a generation. But here you are, huh? And folk think they've got their own minds, and they think they make their own decisions as they go through it, and they've no idea. It's all laid out before them. Everything that's happening today, laid out. But the beauty of it is Fabian after the journal in Rome. You know, you just keep dragging out. Don't do things quickly. Because most folk are short-term thinkers. You want to get it done in your lifetime. Don't you? Most things that you plan when you're young. Yeah, I want to get that done in my lifetime. But if you want to take over a world, for instance, you might get a lot of pushback if you just say, I want to take it over now, and people start fighting, just in a gradual way, and plan that maybe you'll be dead. You might start off the foundation that'll be doing it all, and you may have gone. But down the road, successors that work for the same foundation will make sure it's all implemented, because you change society gradually, incrementally. Gradualism is the key to everything. Step by step, and people are adapting to it. I never forget the examples you had of from a society that was paranoid at one time about governments. They never trusted governments in Britain at one time when I was small. I mean small, or I should say we Scotsmen are never small, they're always we. And I used to listen to the people who even the common miners, the working class people, were well educated, but actually better than they are today, I think, because they read a lot and read like crazy. It was fascinating to see some of the books that they actually read. And they were inquisitive. Their minds were not much better. I think something's happened to our brains. I really do. And there's evidence. They actually say that the United Nations, the IQ tests showing that our IQ is dropping every few years. But back then, they knew who owned the newspapers, they knew who owned the TV stations, they knew who all the lords were in the House of Lords, all the people who were merchants and bankers and very rich people. They knew who they were and who they were before they got the title name, because a lot of them hide behind the title names. It's good camouflage, that. But they would remember, they would keep tabs of things, but they were paranoid of governments, because governments were never there to really help you. They knew that much. That was awfully, they had that. You gotta remember that prior to World War II, they had the huge marches from the Great Depression onwards, that great marches going down to London, to put hand in, back then they didn't just burn and loot down the way down the working classes people, they were pretty peaceful, and they would be helped along the way by folk in different towns that would bring food out to them and tea, etc. But the idea was to bring in petitions to make the point that something had to be done about the mass unemployment in Britain at one point. That's what really stirred people like Orwell, George Orwell, and many others of his ilk as well, who belonged to a different class, But they saw the terrible conditions of the people who didn't have health care, they didn't have unemployment benefits generally, or welfare. Welfare was something you had to get on your knees and beg for, and it came with conditions. They still had poor houses, remember, under different guises, but they're still poor houses. This was Great Britain at the height of its empire. You see, the empire was for the few, again, in the city of London, and for a few thousand families outside of it too, who lived in big estates. And folk don't realise that. They really don't realise that. I can remember, I think it was the Sherlock Holmes series from the 1980s with, was it Jeremy, I can't remember if it was Irons or what his name was, but anyway, it was a good series, but they showed you these big mansions which were actually owned by the elite of the period. Just massive estates, you know, and the buildings they had there with huge pillars, and it's set out in the country. And some of them went to the 1700s, some to the 1600s, when they were appointing folk to be charge of treasuries and the early Bank of England, for instance, and so on, and taxation systems. Incredibly wealthy people. But at least, as I say, in Britain, a lot of folk had their remembrance of all of that. It only took maybe the years from 1980s onwards to folk to start to forget that you got to watch these characters and your governments like hawks all the time. All the time, you know. The people who bring the wars. And don't forget, though, you had people like Tony Blair. I was quite fascinated to see how many wars Britain had been involved with what people thought was a liberal type government. And then Labour government. And it was astonishing under Blair, who was supposedly, people think, he's for Labour, you know. The man had never worked in his life, for goodness sake, eh? He's for Labour, you're kidding me. The guy was, socialism is a tool of the elite. Communism is a tool of the elite. Socialism is just a slower form of it, you see, to get to and it makes perfect sense. I kept saying, wait a minute here, I knew Tony Blair, his mentor, was Isaiah Berlin, you know, and he used to go to him for advice on policies over the public, like positive freedom and negative freedom, and he went to ask him at one point, is it possible to have the two working together in a certain semblance of positive and negative freedom at the same time? But then Tony Blair was like a one-man band, but he had a few around him that were just as supposedly far left as him, who also, they all end up incredibly fabulously wealthy, because they're owned by masters, you see. But when you see the philosophy of socialism, international socialism, the borderless world, mass migration, and Tony Blair was responsible for using the British Army along with America for the Middle Eastern wars. You know, it didn't benefit the average person in Britain or America at all. You were left with the tab, actually. And the fallout, including mass migration, it was all factored into it before they started. Because Tony Blair wanted to destroy the remnants. His left-hand, his left-wing left-hand man said it. The guy next to, who was his deputy, said that a few years later, and I read the articles on the air at the time, that Tony Blair's his policy was to eradicate basically the British, you know, the white British people in Britain itself. That's what his deputy said. It was published in the papers at the time. And you say, well, wait a minute, where does this factor into representing Britain? Well, you got to understand what their concept of Britain is. You got to also see what their concept of going across the Middle East and financing terrorist organizations, even starting them up. They were just mercenary organizations, most of them, to attack other countries. Well, we know there's a pact, but there's a pact involved here. We all know this. We can't go any deeper than a pact. But also, it fulfills socialism's agenda by getting rid of what they claim as secular governments. Even the one in Egypt, when they voted the guy in Egypt, they said it wasn't secular enough, so they had to dethrone him as well. Well, who's they, you know? Did the people in Britain get it? No. Or the US? No. We're as ignorant as ever about it all. Of course we are. But there's always a they there, and it said in the papers that the authorities, whose authorities, said that they wanted secular governments, and because they're easier to rule, you see. People who stick to their religious beliefs will stand up for themselves collectively and be a problem. You do away with that, and folk can't stand up for much for anything at all. In Canada, I can remember years ago when they were deregulating the telecommunications industry, because you had big cable networks in the cities, and And when they were deregulating them to supposedly give more competition, which is a joke, because Canada's nothing but monopolies and cartels working with government. But they said, the snowbirds, the retirees are going to have to start paying the higher prices now, because before they got some kind of subsidy or something, or discount. And that was the only time I remember, and they said this in all the media at the time, the Ottawa, the Parliament, was overwhelmed with letters and complaints and phone calls from people demanding that the snowbirds get their same discounts so as they could get their entertainment. Because you see, that's your propaganda thing. The folk are hooked on it. That's the only time. Did they stand up for anything? No. Did they stand up against the wars across the Middle? No. But they stood up when they take their TV off them and they're ready to march to Ottawa, crutches and all. I mean, it's astonishing to see how things really are. And before I get off that part of the topic, because I'm rambling a bit, it's to do with socialism. So I can remember, as getting back to the people in Britain and elsewhere who knew what socialism was. Nothing is for free. That's one thing they all knew, when nothing is for free, you know. There's conditions. And once you're dependent on a system or parts of a system, they're going to demand more from you and more compliance in ways that's not good for you. Like taking vaccinations is one of them. That's already written into these handouts are given. If you haven't noticed them, have you read the small print everywhere? Nothing's for free. You sign away every right to even say no. If you signed it, well, you're now going to have a problem getting out of it, aren't you? Everything's contractual. Legalities, the law of the sea, maritime law, and all the rest of it. It's so true, isn't it? I love that stuff. But people they don't know. They think they're living in a real system and almost like a small time. Even if you're living in a city now, if you watch television often, you'd think you're living in a small town rural area as they give you the nonsensical, nostalgic drama series and so on. Unless they're giving you the hypersexualized dramas that folk are completely addicted to, and Games of Thrones and all the rest of it, and then you worship the portrayal of sadomasochistic psychopaths as they battle with each other for supremacy. It's quite interesting to see what they've done and what they've made appealing to the public. At the same time, remember, as selected psychologists and behaviorists are given big money put out, and in collusion with BBC and other TV organizations, to put out shows on, under like pseudo-documentaries. Maybe it's a natural thing for psychopaths to rule over us. Maybe we need them. Because they can make the decisions. No kidding, They can make the decisions, There's nothing out there by chance. Nothing. Everything's vetted and for a purpose. And the purpose generally is to get inside your skull and do a bit of tampering and plant itself, and down the road, you'll be saying, maybe we need a psychopath to be a strong man to get us out of this. Yeah, I saw that program too. It seemed quite interesting, It's too easy, isn't it? It really is too easy. That was it. Dexter. I never saw it, but people made a big deal and sent me lots of articles about Dexter. It was about a psychopath who was portrayed as the good guy in some TV drama series, where he'd eliminate the bad guys, like the vigilante type thing, using his cunning and his reason and his inability to get away from him. But he had no personal stake in it. He was a psychopath, you see. I saw recently that 2 women used that in their defense, because they had a relationship together, these 2 women, right? But one of them had been married, I think it was. No, they wanted to get money in, so they decided to use men. They'd lure men in, you see. And that this one young guy who lived in the same apartment building, I don't think he gave him drugs or what they did, but eventually they chopped him up like mincemeat and got rid of parts of his body and the whole thing. They used his cell phone, and they texted his friend. They got to know him well enough to know what his routine was. He would text his friend at a certain, so they did that for 2 or 3 days, so they'd think he was still alive, you see, and things were normal. We wouldn't come looking. And a whole bunch of things that they said they got it all from watching that Dexter. And his money.